Hello everyone, welcome to the second season of Design Inspire Talks. I'm Kadambaris Sahu, your host, founder of Design Inspire platform and SVP Design at ValueLabs. Design Inspire is an initiative to connect designers across the global design community, and Design Inspire Talks is a presentation and discussion series with passionate, innovative, and inspiring designers. It dives deep into their passion, inspiration, and what makes them go. It is an effort to understand how they are navigating their career path and how they are investing their creative energies. We believe hearing their bold moves and inspiring stories will ignite interest and inspire the next generation of budding designers across the globe. So let's go forward with our guest today, Gabriel White. Gabriel is a researcher, strategist, and user experience designer with more than 20 years of experience applying human-centered design methods to help organizations affect meaningful change through design. Since 2010, Gabriel has focused on design for social impact using his global perspective and on the ground experience to help mature organizations and startups to improve education, healthcare, and financial services for low income people across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific. Prior to founding Small Surfaces, Gabriel worked with leading design and technology innovators such as Microsoft Research and Frog Design, as well as leading human centered design teams at Motorola and PunchCut. So let's go forward with your presentation, Cantway. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Today I want to talk a little bit about my journey as a designer, and the kinds of things that I've been working on over the last 11 years as an independent consultant, focused on social impact work, and some of the things that I've learned along the way in that journey. So one of the things that's come up recurrently when I have conversations with designers is that it's very clear that designers care about the world. It's very rare to meet the designer who doesn't want to make the world a better place in some way. Of course, making the world a better place means many different things to many different people. But at its core, I think design is an activity which is directed towards improving the world. And in that context, many times I've thought myself about what it means to do meaningful work. When I think about improving the world, what's meaningful to me? And I want to come on touch on some of those themes as it relates to the journey that I've had as a designer. So for the first 10 years of my career, I worked on some cool stuff. I was working in large tech companies and agencies. Standard commercial environments. I got to work on some really interesting projects with some really interesting people. More than 20 years ago, I worked on the design of one of the first web-based interactive WYSIWYG editors using a technology that would later be called Ajax. I've worked on next generation digital imaging projects for cameras and for in-home imaging products. I've worked with artificial intelligence researchers who are developing tools to analyze music and working with them to think about how their technology could be used to enhance the music listening experience. I had a lot of fun working on this stuff. There were some really interesting problems, some really difficult problems, and probably even more importantly, I got to work with some really intelligent people who provoked me to think differently about the way I do design, what design practice means, and really helped me grow as a designer. During that period, I spent some time working at Microsoft Research in China, and I was just wrapping that up, and I was on my way planning to leave China. And a couple of weeks before I left, Motorola called me and asked me to interview to lead their UX design team in the studio that they had in Beijing. And literally on the way to the airport, I went to the interview with my suitcase in hand. I interviewed with them, left the country, and then 3 weeks later, I was back in China starting this job at Motorola. And while I was at Motorola, I was given the opportunity to lead the UX design of a totally new phone platform that they were developing at the time, which was targeting low literacy, low income customers in low income countries. So at the time, this was about 15 years ago now, Nokia owned the market if you looked anywhere in Africa or South Asia, and Motorola wanted to enter those markets with products to compete with Nokia. And so the team, it was a super interesting project for me, in that the product itself was designed especially for people who had low levels of literacy and also maybe were less experienced with technology. And that for me was a penny drop moment. I was like, oh, I realized at that point that technology and design can be used to address social problems. In this case, it was about access to communication. And that thought was quite impactful for me at the time. After that, I went back into more standard commercial environments. But it was a few years later that with that kind of idea echoing around in my head, I decided to reorient my work towards working on meaningful problems. And to me, at that moment, that meant working on social impact projects in low-income countries. And that's when I started the consulting business that I've been working on for the last 11 years. So over the last 11 years, I've had the chance to work on some pretty interesting projects. I've worked with an education startup in Kenya that was trying to build a network of low-cost schools that provide comparatively high-quality education, so improving educational access for people who would otherwise be in the public education system, and using a lot of technology to drive the success of that business. I've worked with a mobile financial services startup in Myanmar to provide access to financial services to people who previously didn't have access to the formal banking sector. I've done work with medical startups. The one example here is a project that I did working on a portable HIV testing unit that was designed to be used by community health workers in low-income countries. They could carry this unit to the village and do HIV testing remotely. I've done work with organisations to help people be better prepared for and better respond to bushfires, to help them manage the difficulties of that process. More recently, I've done work in India on a project to help build the capacity of small business owners to help improve their business management skills so that they can both be more profitable and also be more resilient in the context of shocks. And another example is I did some work with a small startup in South Africa that was working with small-scale fishermen to help them both obtain access to their fishing rights, so to help them get permits, and that required them to do a whole lot of record keeping, as well as creating a marketplace to help them sell their catch directly to end consumers rather than going through middlemen, and helping improve their financial situations. So there are a bunch of things that I've learned in the course of doing all this work. Some themes that have sort of come out recurrently through the different projects. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about those themes and how that's affected the work that I've been doing. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is literalness. When you talk about people who have low levels of literacy, and there are two ways of thinking about literacy when we're thinking about design and technology. One is basic literacy, people's ability to read and write, and the other one is technological literacy, people's familiarity and comfort and competence using digital tools. In both senses, if you're working with people who have low levels of basic literacy as well as technological literacy, it's very common for people to interact with systems and take what they see very literally. Often we use metaphor in design. Metaphors can often be difficult to understand for people who have less experience using technology. So one example, and this is going back to the work that I did at Motorola, is the work that we did to design the icons that were used in the main menu of the phone. We spent a lot of time working on the icons, and one of the things that we found, for example, is that this is the ringtone selector icon. And one of the things that we found is people's ability to interpret the meaning of this icon was very dependent on small changes to the design of the icon. So in some cultures, for example, the clapper, which is the piece that hangs down in the bell, has a ball at the end, and in other cultures, it's just a square piece of metal that has it. It's not a ball shape. And a small change in the design in relation to that element would have a big impact on people's ability to understand the meaning of the icon. And so I guess that's just an indication of like small details can have a really big impact on people's ability to understand it. And that's why when you're designing for this segment, you really need to sweat the details, because they can have a massive impact on people's ability to interact with and understand a service. Here's another example of some work that I did with a bank in Nigeria. We were designing a USSD service for interacting with the bank, and so we were focused on trying to understand the best way to communicate with people through this USSD service in a way that would be easy to understand. And we tried a few different approaches. We used more formal, traditional language. So that's where the example at the top there says transaction failed, insufficient money. We used Pidgin English. So the language of the street in Nigeria is a Creole, a Pidgin English. And so we tried writing the message in Pidgin English, which is what you see at the bottom. And then the third option that we tried was kind of a formal English, but simple and using concrete language. So the example you see there, it didn't work, not enough money. And interestingly, the Pidgin English one was the one that was most easily understood, but people felt like it was totally inappropriate for a bank to be using that kind of language interacting with them. And what was successful was the version where we used simple concrete language. It didn't work, not enough money. And the difference that we saw between the transaction failed message and the it didn't work message was really significant. And again, it's just an indication of how important it is to sweat those small details, because people do approach these kinds of things very literally, and they often have very limited capacity to imagine what it is that you're trying to communicate if it doesn't come across as immediately obvious. Oops. So then the next thing that I wanted to talk about is about focus and confidence. So I talked before about how often people don't necessarily feel that confident interacting with digital technology because they're not necessarily so experienced, and also given typically lower levels of education and lower literacy, there's just they're in themselves often just generally less confident about being successful in using these kinds of things. So one of the things that I've learned along the way is that it's really important to focus people's attention as much as you can. So the example here is for a mobile financial service that I worked on in Myanmar, and this is in the transaction flow. But one of the things that we did is we asked the users to do one thing at a time. So in this case, it's how much money do you want to send, or how much airtime do you want to top up? We don't present multiple options on one screen, so it's not uncommon in these kinds of services to have several fields on a screen where you ask who you're sending it to, how much money do you want to send, when do you want it sent, to put that all together, because that makes people feel like they're being more efficient. But that in this context was overwhelming. So what we did is we made one task per screen, and we provided a little bit of essential supporting information. So in this case, the balance of the account, and the person who you're sending it to, just to reassure people that the choice that they made previously is correct. So having that focus can really have a big effect on people's ability to successfully interact with digital services. The other thing that I've learned is about spatiality and linearity, and I'll get into some examples to explain that because it probably sounds very abstract, but historically, before everyone started using computer technology, when we were interacting with items of technology, they had interfaces that were something like this. And one of the attributes that an interface like this has is that it's spatialized. So all the controls have a unique physical location and a unique physical appearance. They might have a different color, a different shape. And so we can use our spatial memory to learn and remember how to interact with it. We don't necessarily need to be able to read to be able to successfully use a device like this. We can be shown it, and then we can just use our spatial memory. As humans, we're just very, very good at using spatial memory because we live in a three-dimensional world. The problem when you get with digital technology is that everything gets collapsed onto a single, very small piece of space. That very small screen does everything. It can represent millions of different things. And so it becomes more and more difficult for people to use their spatial memory when interacting with a service or with a device. So again, coming back to the example from this phone that I worked on, one of the things that we did is we spatialized the user interface. So the key element here is that at the bottom of the screen we showed the main menu. You can see that the ringtone item is being shown here. At the bottom of the screen we showed the main menu, and the only thing that we showed at the bottom of the screen was the main menu. So people could learn that if they saw anything at the bottom of the screen, it was the menu, it wasn't anything else. And so that would help people use their spatial memory to orient themselves and learn how to use the device. And then in terms of linearity, one of the things that we're very accustomed to doing as designers, people who use technology regularly, we're very accustomed to building a mental model of a system that we're using. So we do it unconsciously, but as we navigate an app or if we navigate a website, we just naturally start to build a model of how the system is organized that we're interacting with, the different categories, where I am in the system, what other options are available to me. That as a digital literacy skill is a learned skill, and it's not something that people can do automatically by interacting with systems. It's very common to see people who have less experience using technology to be very difficult for them to work out where the beginning of something is. There's not a clear sense of like where they are in a system, and so as a result, when you're thinking about designing the information architecture or the structure of these systems, it's really important to make it as simple and flat as possible. So typically I would try to put all the principal navigation options on the home screen of an application, and once I choose any one of them, try to avoid having subsequent choices beyond that. So the mental model that a user needs to build of the system is very simple, and thus it's much easier for them to orient themselves in the system and not feel lost. And if once people feeling lost, the confidence levels drop significantly and their ability to succeed is diminished greatly. So it's really important to not put too much burden on people to build a mental model of the systems that they're using. Another thing that's come up in the work that I've been doing is about sharing. So again, I'm sure that the designers participating in this talk, we all have our own personal mobile device, whether it's a smartphone or a feature phone, but that device is probably just used by yourself. And what you find, again, when you're working with lower income populations is that while there may be a primary device user, devices are often shared amongst several people. And it's something that you need to consider in the way that you design services. Firstly, from the perspective of privacy, understanding that it's not just one person who'll be in the device, so what privacy implications does that have for what's going on in the service you're delivering, but then also thinking about what it means for multiple different people to be using the same service on that device. So it's not just one person using an app, but it could be several different people with different needs using the same application. How do you deal with that kind of complexity? And it's something that comes up recurringly in the work that I've been doing. And the final piece that I wanted to talk about is how you help overcome some of these barriers in terms of ramping people up and giving them confidence, teaching them new concepts, giving them new skills, because inevitably, even for more sophisticated users, we need to be able to go through a path of being able to adopt a new service, which involves some kind of learning. People who have more confidence doing that, it's much easier because they just have a stronger self-belief that they can do it. For people who lack that confidence, it's really important to plot a path for how you can build that confidence, teach people the concepts that they need to be able to successfully use a service. So For example, coming back to the work that I did for this financial service in Myanmar, one of the things that we worked really hard to do is help people understand how to read a transaction history. So, transaction histories in general are difficult to read. I know I struggle with them when I need to review it. And so imagine someone who has lower levels of literacy and lower competence interacting with this, zero experience using a formal financial service. It could be very overwhelming. And so the technique that we used, which we found very successful in this project, was after a person completed any transaction, we would show them a transaction record for the transaction that they just completed. So you can see here the number with the arrow and the two avatars. And in that way, when they needed to go to the transaction history, they'd already seen all these transactions before, and it was much easier for them to understand and engage with a large number of transactions. It wasn't so overwhelming for them because they'd seen each of them individually and they felt like they could manage understanding and interpreting that. So through that process, we were teaching people as they do it. And then when it came to troubleshooting, when people needed to go back to their transaction history to figure out what had happened, they had the confidence and understanding to be able to interpret this large amount of information. So I just wanted to come back to where I started, which is talking about what it means to work on meaningful problems. I think that for me, meaningful problems are problems that have a social impact component. I think that, and in that way, I've been focused on work in low-income countries over the last 11 years. But I think there are lots of different ways of thinking about what it is to do meaningful work. And I think that as designers, there are lots of opportunities to seek out ways to have an impact, ways to solve interesting problems, ways to work with interesting people, but also to work on meaningful problems. Meaningful problems doesn't mean you have to work for free. People sometimes think, oh, but that means I'm going to be volunteering at a non-profit organization. I can't make a living doing that. But I think that's not the case. There are many opportunities in government and in businesses where they're doing initiatives that are meaningfully impactful. A lot of my clients are businesses. And there's a lot of opportunity there to find and engage in work that is going to have an impact. For me, I feel like I'm just in the process of coming to the end of this second chapter of my career. The first chapter being my work in the standard commercial sector. The second chapter, the last 11 years that I've been working on these projects in low-income countries. I'm in the process of reorienting myself to try to focus more on climate change issues. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to solve that problem, how it's going to turn out, but I feel like that's where the meaningful work is for me in the next chapter of my career, and I'm looking forward to finding out what that means for me. So thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for sharing, your thoughts. It really resonated. I think it resonated with me, but I'm sure it is resonating with all of the viewers. Meaningful work, right? Something that all the designers dream of. They hope they're doing it. And I also like, the things that you just talked about, be it, it's always a learning, and it's always a new way to look at life, right? Like first, I think, some of the years went in, commercial work. Second is social impact. Third is climate change, and it's always changes, right? Like design is something that I think it just fuels us to do more and more meaningful work, as you talked about. Also, one thing that I would take away from your talk would be that meaningful work is not for free. Uh, that's a good perception you busted for many people, and so good that you did that, because it really matters. Um, we'll transition now to the second part of the show, where we would talk about more of your creative journey and processes, and more about just everything design. So
Great.
we'll start with the first question. Design is still a very unconventional path, right, to take, from, like, many people, even like, at least in our part of the world, many people of the people don't even know that it exists, or some of the courses, of the design discipline exist, and of course it is changing every year. So how did you decide, and what was your motivation to get into design, and how did you discover it?
Yeah, look, it was a little bit of by accident, to be honest. So at the time that I started working as a designer, it wasn't possible to study human-centered design, user experience design. I got a job as a tech writer out of university, and it was uh, through that job I started reading about the usability. There was a community of technical writers who were talking about the usability of documentation, how it is that in testing documentation, and through that little peephole, a whole world opened up for me in terms of thinking about human-centered design. Basically, that was the lead-in for me for that. And I got more and more interested in it, and decided that that's something I wanted to do, and then sought a job, and I managed to land a job. At the time, there was one human-centered design agency in Australia. The community was very, very small at the time, 20 years ago, and I got a job there, and that formed my work there. Basically, formed my apprenticeship in design, and I haven't looked back.
Wow. And what were you studying at that point of time in the university?
Say
What were
that
you,
again.
what were you
I was studying philosophy, and that's something that's come back to me. I guess more recently I've been thinking about ethics and design, and I think that that's kind of an echo of the kinds of things that I was doing as at my time at university.
Oh, talking of ethics and design, I think let's take up that topic. For you, what do you think ethics and design is, or what is good design for you?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that so to me, well, I guess it's more and more becoming a topic of discussion, particularly as you think about climate change is becoming a bigger topic, and more talked about in the design community. And I think if you think about what climate change is as a problem, it's an ethical problem. It's not that practically we have to solve it. It's that we should solve it. And I think it's bringing to the fore these kinds of ethical questions and forcing the design community to think about the ethical dimension of the work that we're doing. And so I think historically, what good design has meant is, there's been the three pillars: that it meets the design of the user, can be supported by the technology that's available, and also meets the needs of the organization or business that's being designed for. And so those three pillars have never really changed in the time that I've been working as a designer. And what I think is that we need a fourth pillar, which is what is good or what is right.
Yeah.
And I think climate change kind of speaks to that as that kind of a pillar. And so some of the things that I've been working on is thinking about what it means to do ethical design. And I think there are a couple of different ways of thinking about that. One is working on problems that in themselves are inherently good in some way. So that's kind of what I've been doing over the last 11 years myself, is seeking out problems where I'm going to benefit people who are disadvantaged in some way. But the reality of design work is that most designers aren't working on those kinds of problems. I mean, you can argue that the thing that I'm working on is going to benefit the end users in some way, address some of their needs, so that is some inherent good, but it's less clear cut, at least, about the ethical dimension of the work. And so the other part of it is thinking about what does it mean to do ethics in the context of that everyday design activity. And where I've been trying to explore and I've been thinking about recently is thinking about how we can create tools that help bring the ethical dimension into the everyday practice of design. As designers, we're really into using tools and methods in our work. And so something that smells like a tool or a method, I think, would be much easier to introduce into design practice, and also help designers have conversations with their partners about design. And so what I've been doing is trying to develop a set of design heuristics for ethics. So, for example, thinking about autonomy. What is it? How is it the thing that I'm creating help people take independent control of their lives, make their own decisions, self-actualize themselves in the context of the use of the service that we're creating? How do they understand the implications of what it is they're doing? in the use of a product or service. So there are different things that I think can help introduce ethical elements into design that I think will be great if we can start to consider as designers. Climate, I think, is one of those.
Do you also have some frameworks or things that you might have come across looking at ethics in design?
Yeah, well, I think that it's still kind of green fields a bit. People are trying to figure out what it means. I think the big challenge is that the big battle that designers have faced over the last 20 years, and in some places it's still a battle, is convincing organizations of the value of design as a service and human-centered design as a method. And I think that there's been a big culture change in the way organizations work, which is great. It makes lives much easier for us as designers. We can focus on solving the problems rather than convincing people that we need to be in the room in the first place. But I think it's kind of a similar challenge facing ethics, and I think it's a harder one too, because it's easy to say we followed a human-centered design method and now customer satisfaction is up X%, or we've got X, Y more revenue, or whatever that might be. Like, it's joining the dots with the human-centered design process and the benefits for an organization is relatively straightforward. But with ethics, it doesn't work like that. Because there's no kind of business metric that you can attach to an ethical outcome. And so that's where it's more about finding ways to appeal to people's sense of what's right, and also finding ways to introduce it in a way that's not seen as disruptive to to current processes. And that's why I believe that, I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff to be had in this idea of heuristics, simple tools. I don't think design teams or their work partners have the time or inclination to spend hours or days reflecting on the ethical situation they're in. I think it's more about giving them practical tools that help them just take an ethical lens to the problem that they're working on, and at least introduce that into the conversation that they're having. It may not be that it turns what they're doing upside down, but at least it becomes part of the conversation. And I think that's a very important first step.
Yeah, I totally think so. Like, with the current world that we're living in, with data issues that are happening, with privacy issues, with, so many things. And I think all started with good intention, right? Like, if you take up the menace right now that the world is facing of polarization with respect to data and things like that, it was never intended to be, right? I think what kind of design impact would be there, with the behaviors, with the system that we create, is something. It's something that we need to think about. And I totally, you're talking about the ethics. Part of it is so important because we are building behaviors, right? When we are building platforms. I just want to understand, like, some of your thoughts on, designers do end up building a lot of systems and behaviors and attitudes, right? And have you, like, just your thoughts on, how could that be, like, when they're looking at designing something? Are there any consideration that they need to take when they're, starting out on, let's say, ideation or, building such kind of services?
Yeah. Look, so. Well, if I was to follow the idea of design heuristics, ethical heuristics that I was following, I think that one of the things that is often done at the beginning of a design process is you identify business objectives.
Yeah.
You create user personas, defining the people who you're designing for, what their situation is, what their characteristics are, what their needs are. And I think that similarly, there's an opportunity to define what it means to think about the ethical dimension of the problem. And so the example that I gave before is autonomy. Other things could be like growth. How are we helping people grow, self-actualize themselves, grow in themselves? How are we helping improve their well-being? How are we helping encourage connection? Meaningful connections between people. So I think that it could be relatively easy to identify the ethical elements of the design, and as you would have business objectives, personas, maybe design principles. You could have ethical principles or ethical guides for the work that you're doing. And as you go through the design process, you can just refer back to them as one of the things that you need to consider in relation to all the other things that you need to consider as a designer. And the team, they become an artifact that is in the room when you're ideating. They become an artifact in the room when you're presenting to clients or to other stakeholders. And that, you introduce that into the conversation. Like I said before, I don't imagine that it doesn't make much sense to try to turn the world upside down doing this. But if it's part of the conversation, and it may be that the teams discount the importance of these things, like we say, okay, yes, acknowledge that exists, and that's a consideration that is valid. Unfortunately, there's another priority from this other side that is more important than that. That's okay. But at least that element has been introduced into the conversation and the team has consciously excluded it. And that in itself is starting to help people understand that these things need to be considered, even if they are excluded.
In your creative journey, you have worked in various different countries with various different cultures, right? I want to understand, what has been your experience, like experiencing different cultures by living in those different countries over the years, and how has that affected your creative process or things that you design now?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think one of the wonderful things about being a designer is that you are constantly the student in many ways. Like you're the student in terms of the subject matter experts that you're working with, or you're the student in terms of the users that you're working with. And so it's a constantly humbling experience doing human-centered design and rewarding because you get to learn about different ways people live and engage with the world. And I think that for me, that has been amplified significantly by having the opportunity to live and work in different countries, because when you're living in a different culture, there are so many different assumptions, so many assumptions that are different, so many practices that are different, that it really forces you to challenge your own assumptions as a designer. And I think in that it's opened my world in terms of thinking about what is possible with design or what it means to do good design, to design effectively. And that's been tremendously rewarding for me, and also I think has made me a better designer.
Yeah, I think can't disagree there. With different perspective, with different cultural experiences, I think it just opens our mind, right? And you rightly pointed, like sometimes we assume something. Oh, this is like but we forget that it's part of our culture maybe to assume these kind of things. And when you're designing something for like a set of people who are not from the same culture, then there are certain things to look at. I just want to know from the wealth of knowledge, looking at different, countries and different places that you've, stayed in. So what was one of those kind of assumptions that, sort of like struck with you when you thought that, okay, this is like, they'll understand, but then, it came out as a shock that, oh, this is not what it is. If you can
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of little examples. I think that it's very. I mean, even the example that I showed before about the
Yeah.
wording that was used for the banking service, where my naive assumption would be the most easily understandable would be the most appealing, but of course it turned out that it wasn't. I think that there have been there are lots of things that just wouldn't occur to you, like things about security, for example, like people's use of devices and how it relates to their perception of personal security. And for example, people have a preference often for carrying around devices that look cheaper. And so they could have a smartphone with a bigger screen, but they actually have one with a smaller screen because they're concerned if they had a more flashy device, they might be a target for it being stolen. So there are just all these. It's often in the details about how like some sort of assumption that someone has about one little bit of their life actually has a big impact, because if I have to design for a screen that's 4 inches big versus a design for a screen that's 6 inches big, it's a whole different kind of set of design assumptions that I need to take. And so it's often in those little details that you find the big things that is like, okay, I've really got to rethink the way I'm approaching this problem. Or demanding people to use a service on the street in public, even, like, again, related to security. If people don't feel comfortable pulling something out on the street, then in what context are they going to actually be able to use the service? And how do we design the service to fit around that?
Yeah, very interesting. How these things sometimes lead us to think in very different ways. Like, you also talked about, let's say, the cell phone usage, where we are using currently as designers, like one screen, like one phone per person. But when you look at, designing for low income group, it becomes like a place where, sort of maybe the whole household is using it or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. I want to build on this particular instance, and I want to understand that you've worked on many projects of these nature, right? Where you're designing for customers, users from low income group. Can you share some more experiences like you just did, like for just where you found like a bigger difference in terms of you just talked about a flashy device that they were like, really afraid to carry that if they're stolen somewhere. So that's this another one dimension that you looked at. Second, you talked about the language that you have used, and third, you just talked about in the presentation where it was like more of a community device. Are there like even more sort of things that you sort of looked at when you're designing specifically for low income groups?
So I think that often the challenge when you're introducing digital services
Mhm.
to people,
Yeah,
you're often replacing an existing behavior.
yeah,
And so, because people who haven't been using smartphones, of course, have been living a life. It's not like they haven't been able to live without the technology. The technology is often it could be a substantial improvement, but it's nonetheless it's probably improving on something that they already do. And so one of the challenges that we often face in the work that we do is trying to understand how understanding the importance of what people currently do and how that relates to the thing that we're creating, uh, and what that transition looks like. What's the one problem that we really need to solve for them that's going to really draw them into adopting a service, so that then they may be able to explore more. So for example, and again, I don't think there are any earth-shattering examples. Again, it's just about the details, getting the details right. The kinds of things that we need to consider, like for the design of that HIV testing unit, for example, we had the assumption that the team had based on research was that these people may not be able to read. So even the community health worker who's taking this to the village, they need to be able to use this without necessarily being able to read a user interface. And so that created a whole, of course, if I was in a wealthier country, I would never have to have that assumption. But so that really pushed the team to focus on how can we create these visual narratives that were instructions effectively of what people do, because it was a multi-step process in terms of using the device, and especially and how, particularly dealing with problems like troubleshooting when there was an error. How do we handle this all with visual narratives and coming up with ways to do that that is going to make sense in that context? Or when we're talking about financial services, what is the one transaction that is people going to love to do? That's going to be solves their biggest pain point. How can we make that as easy and as straightforward as possible, so that once they've adopted that and had success with that, then they can have the confidence to be able to think, oh, maybe I could do some more with this. So it's really a bit about being sensitive to those details.
I really liked in the presentation how you had put those arrows, like, depicting the flow of the money from which to, like, from where it started and where it had gone, like credited, debited, if you write. Sometimes, it confuses even me as a person who's been like, dealing with money for some time now, but sometimes like there's still a second before I know that credited means like it's the money has come to me or it has gone from me. So
No,
I
no,
really
I think it's a question. It's a question that the design teams at all the big banks need to answer. I don't know why transaction histories are still so difficult to read. There's so much opportunity to make it much easier for everyone. But in this case, one of the luxuries that we had is that we expected people to be transacting in relatively low volumes. And so we took that opportunity to use quite a lot of vertical real estate
yeah.
to explain the transaction. But even in high transaction volume environments, there's an opportunity to make it all so much easier to understand.
Yeah, I think not only that, I think some of the things if we make simpler in finance, there's like so much of divide. We had one of our guests talk about like the financial divide in terms of low income, or let's say even when you take that to even gender issues, right? Like how much financial education women have and men have, and how they invest sort of their money. We can actually spin up a whole new sort of debate as to how things are getting done, and are they causing like more division in terms of society, or
Right.
what. So if we solve that problem, probably and make finance a little accessible, maybe we are also solving many other layers of problem. So yeah,
Right.
maybe simple things, simple it may look like, but yeah, something that really to look forward to. um, I also want to understand, like, difference between when you were designing for commercial and social or non-profit sort of setup. What did you find like significantly different in these two sectors or segments in your life?
Yeah, look, I think that as far as doing design, there's really not a lot of difference. I think that both contexts, the standard design process is extremely useful and productive. I think that the big difference between non-profits and businesses or government and business is the kind of metrics that they have to measure success, and how that affects the decisions that you make along the way. In the end, a business needs to make money, and that's not necessarily the case with non-profits or government. That said, often more and more non-profits are being pushed to demonstrate that the work that they're doing is scalable. And that in some way means that they have a way of growing and sustaining services that they're providing, even if it's not necessarily customers paying for it, some sustainable income. And so in lots of ways, actually, NGOs need to think the same way as a business, even if the transactions that they're doing are not necessarily the same as the way that a business would do.
How do you measure impact for social or commercial project?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I myself, in the projects that I do, I don't specifically measure the impact of the project. The work that I do is in itself impactful. It's designed to provide benefits. But what does happen subsequently is that my clients would be measuring that in terms of uptake or adoption of the service, whether it's transaction volume or engagement or changes in behaviour. They keep close track of that, and I hear back from them occasionally about how things are going.
Yeah, I think as designers, and we talked about ethics also. I think there's also sort of things which is not measured. Sometimes it is, sometimes it is not. But the intangibles part of it, right? That you talked about, the behaviors, the change of that. And I think maybe if that was a metric, we could have understood, like what kind of behavior changes are we getting? Is it worth it?
Yeah, and I think that to your point earlier about the challenges that have been identified with social media, is that part of the reason that it's such a problem is because the metrics are wrong.
Exactly.
And all the whole business, including the designers working in those businesses, are oriented towards engagement metrics. And so it's just about increasing engagement, increasing engagement, increasing engagement. And to that end, I think that we need to think about, like, metrics affect everything systematically, and it's the shining light that everyone follows. And so I think we do need to reconsider, in light of all the problems that we've seen with social media, the kinds of metrics that we use need to be reconsidered. It's very important.
I was other day, looking at some of the, sort of the things that social media has created. Like, for example, each social media is affording certain sort of behavior. Like, for example, if you look at Instagram, where people are trying to become, using so many filters, trying to become better and better in terms of, how they represent themselves. And then there's also psychological effect of that. In fact, there are certain words coined now after looking at, the things that are happening. So yeah, I think the ethical dimension stands there too, like the kind of impacts that we would be creating. We don't want to create a Frankenstein out of our things. Talking about now, shifting gears towards we do talk about some of the projects of yours. I want to understand which one has been the most satisfying one for you.
There are a couple of projects where I've felt like I've been able to go deep in a way that I haven't with others, and it's been extremely rewarding in that way. So one engagement that I had was with this startup in Kenya, the education startup, where they're building a network of thousands of schools. And each of those schools uses quite a bit of technology in it to help them run, both from a management and teaching perspective. And I was lucky enough to work on the first generation of the tools that they were using in the schools for the school managers and also for the teachers. And the way that they were approaching solving that problem and using technology and trying to create consistent quality was very interesting, just in terms of the business model and business approach. That was super interesting, super rewarding, and it was just a team that was very engaged in the problem, very engaged in design. So they saw the value of design, and also really willing to experiment. So that was just a super interesting and super fun engagement, which was great. And the other one that I think similarly, the financial service that I worked on in Myanmar, it was a team that believed in design. We had the opportunity to go deep in the research, and we really had the opportunity to sit back and reflect on the details of the design in a way that often doesn't happen in other engagements. Often, I don't often have the luxury of time. And it was really just wonderful to have that opportunity to go deep and really think the problem through. And I think that the solution that we came up with really reflected the depth of thinking there. So it was very satisfying to do that work.
Good to hear that. And now coming to pandemic, right? It has affected everybody. Has it affected your work, or has it affected your creative process? How are you coping with it?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I've been sitting at this desk here for 11 years working remotely with clients. So the pandemic started and I just came back to my desk as usual. So in that sense, it wasn't too disruptive for me. But equally, I used to travel quite a bit to do field work, and that's completely stopped through the pandemic. So one of the big learning curves through the course of the pandemic for me is how to conduct field work without going to the field. And so there's been some interesting and challenging opportunities that I've had to conduct remote field work, where I'm remote from where the field work's been conducted, and even the facilitators of the field work are often remote from the respondents. They might be in the country that the research is being conducted in, but they may not be physically co-located with the respondent. So with this sort of triangle setup, all online. And then with respondents who, again, they're not necessarily super confident with technology, where connectivity is not great. So it was pretty challenging. I think I was surprised how successful we were able to be in that context, but it definitely wasn't anywhere near as good as being there in person. But at least we were able to engage those people to participate in the research while we were doing the work, rather than excluding them completely. So there was value in that, but it has been very difficult to do.
How are you staying motivated and inspired? Like, what do you do to keep yourself fueled? The passion burning.
Well, I guess there are two things. One is to just stay connected with what's going on in the design community in general. I think, especially as an independent consultant, it's easy to get isolated. And so I try as much as I can to participate in the community, in events, and staying connected with what people are talking about. And that in itself is quite interesting and engaging. But I think that, as I talked about in my presentation, I think the thing that really motivates me in the end is to work on things that I care about. And in the first 10 years of my career, I was working on things that I cared about. What I cared about was interesting, tricky problems. Now I care about social impact, and the work that I hope to be doing in the next 10 years is about climate change. So I think that for me, like that, the intrinsic is really important, and I think so long as I can keep doing that, I'll continue to remain motivated. I honestly, after the first 10 years of my working life, I was like, maybe I should not be a designer anymore. I just ran out of steam as a designer. I didn't have the motivation, and I realized that for me, it was the content that that needed to be different. And I think that I'll continue changing that until as long as I need to remain engaged.
Yeah, so purpose and meaning is something that keeps you motivated and inspired.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd like to know some of the media recommendation like books, podcast, or anything that you listen, or you would advise the younger, designers to go about it, read. It can be anything, like even movies are good.
That's a great question. I think that I'm very picky with what I read personally, just to sort of keep my finger on the pulse. So I think there are a couple of UX weekly newsletters that I receive. I can't remember the names of them off the top of my head, but there's kind of like collections of articles that are going on around the web with posts and what people are talking about. I feel like that's really important, just to understand what the state of play is in terms of tools, process, technology trends, all those sorts of things. I think that's just really important as a designer. You have to keep on maintaining your knowledge and skills, because everything just keeps changing. I think that in general, my advice to sort of younger designers, aside from things to consume, is just about. I think that a lot of design training is very focused on process and tools, and so I think it's easier as a younger designer to be focused on process and tools. And I think that it's important to remember that design is a problem-solving activity. The process and tools help us do that, but they're not the only way to do that. And I think that it's often really important as designers just to step away from the technology and pick up the paper and pen and work through problems in a way, in a structure, in a process that's not so dependent on technology to enable it, and understand that the process helps guide us through the steps that are going to help us get a good outcome, but equally the process isn't the thing that rules us. It's not by following the process, it doesn't guarantee that we'll get a great outcome. It's one thing that helps us get a good outcome. And so I think that it's really important to have that base knowledge, but also understand that it's not what it's all about.
You touched on a great point, right? Like, there are a lot of things that you said, and it's super important. So I'll just sort of accentuate on that. You talked about that, process is just a guide. It's not a template for success, and the second thing I want to talk about, like, keeping up with the technology that you talked about. And the time you worked, you have worked in the industry, the technology has gone like really changed from the screens that we saw to the screens that we are having today, to AI interfaces and things like that. And you did talk about, like, you worked on the research programs and some of the early times of uh, mobile phones and all. So I just want to know your experiences and what your thoughts about this changing way of technology, and how did you kept at designing during these changing times.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I think that one thing that's I feel has changed significantly in the last 20 years uh, is patterns.
Mhm.
So I think that, say, from like 2000 to 2015 maybe, um, a lot of design work was very exploratory in terms of the way you think about creating a solution uh, wasn't necessarily governed in so many ways that it is now today, in terms of the kinds of patterns that you can pull on as a designer. And so a lot of the problems that we were trying to solve were basic pattern problems, like what is the pattern that works, trying to come up with the patterns. And of course, there were, not to say that there weren't patterns being established with like left-hand navigation on websites, like just basic things that emerged pretty quickly. But there were lots of things in terms of how you design transactions, how you design messages, how you like things like shopping carts, like all these elements that are sort of taken as given today were still being defined. And so I think that a lot of that, like, and now, I mean, aside from the changing in technology and devices and all the rest, now what I'm finding more and more, at least in terms of screen design, um, is that we have a fairly well-established set of patterns that we can work with, that are proven to work and also well recognized by end users. And so the design problem has kind of moved up a level. It's like, how do we work with these patterns to create appropriate solutions? So it's less about the mechanics so much of the design solution, the ingredients. It's more about what's the recipe that we're going to use to put these ingredients together. And so I think it gives designers more time to think about the bigger problem than the smaller problem, which is what to put into the recipe. So yeah, I think that that's a big change. But then also at the same time, all these audio interfaces are emerging now with these intelligent assistants, and I think it's a similar kind of world that's being explored at the moment in there that was being explored 20 years ago with screen interfaces. It's kind of like defining those characteristics, defining those patterns. I mean, there are some patterns that are starting to emerge, but it's still very much being defined and explored at the moment. So it seems more settled in one place. It's much more open in others.
Yeah, wow, that must be really exciting times, right? To define like the new way of behavioral mechanics. But yeah, what you rightly pointed out, not only those mechanics at that point of time might have been like really challenging in terms of laying out how do you talk about do you guide a certain way in a certain interface, which is again with VR audio interfaces that you rightly pointed out that. And I think one of the things that you talked about, that now that we've got through the mechanics problem, we can solve a little more. Lot more time can be given to the problems. I think that also serves as advocacy for many design systems that are in place these days, right? Now people just
Exactly, exactly,
they're looking.
exactly. A lot of the problems that we used to have to solve have already been solved, which doesn't mean we're out of work as designers. It just means that we need to work on higher order problems.
Yeah, yeah, that's so good, right? Each day, like each and every day, we're getting to a little more challenging in a way, more stimulating sort of place. Let me ask you another question. It's great amount of wealth of sort of experience that you've had, when you started out, and the accidental profession in a way that you discovered, and then you sort of went through it. I want to just ask, like, if I ask you now to go back to your past and advise something to your younger self. It can be 5 year, 10 year, 15 year younger self. What would that be?
Um, I think that I think that there are two things. I guess one thing that I have done well, and one thing that I should have done differently. I think that as designers, it is like one of the things that's been extremely valuable for me is having the opportunity to have this opportunity to explore and understand different ways of living. For me, that's been through travel, but doesn't necessarily have to be through travel. But I think that one of the things that as designers I think is really valuable is just getting different perspectives on the world. So I'm always interested in designers who come to the profession from a different background, because with that they bring a whole bunch of different ways of thinking and different expectations of the world, than someone who's maybe has only trained as a designer. And so I think that that's something that is important, is valuable in design as a profession, and I've been lucky enough to do. I think that the other thing that I wish I'd done, and this is more reflecting on my time as a consultant, is just not. It's very easy as a consultant to get stressed about where the next paycheck's coming from, and I think that over the course of the last 11 years, there are probably a few times I've taken up work where I probably shouldn't have. I just felt like I had to because I needed to fill a gap in my schedule. And I think that those moments were not necessary in the end. I think that one of the luxuries that we have in design is that the tech industry is growing. The demand for designers is growing, at least at the moment. And so I think, and in that way, often we have the luxury as designers to be able to find the things that really connect with us and we find engaging. And I think that take that opportunity while you have it, I'd say.
Well, this was more of a reflection on your past, and continuing in that vein, I want to understand like some of the advice you want to give like the current young designers, though you did say that take the most of the moment, right? Are there some more suggestion, comments, or just advice from you for the young and budding designers?
Yeah. Look, I think that well, what I mentioned before, I think was probably the most important thing is just like to really understand design as a problem-solving activity. Like, forget about the tools, forget about the process. Take that all away. It's about being a creative problem solver, and you do that by understanding the people that you're designing for and understanding the technology, and user interface or user experience is a medium for expressing that problem solving. But behind that, there's the problem solving that needs to happen. And even when you're working on what you consider a trivial problem, it's really important to understand, like keep that broader context in mind, to be able to really tie everything together effectively, and to be able to tell that story about design. I think that design is, I kind of think about design as partly a therapeutic activity. We identify problems and we solve those problems, so it's kind of like therapy, and we use design as our therapeutic tool. And so, what does it really mean to help people or to solve problems in that context? And also it's just easy to get distracted, I think, by what's the cool thing, what's the fun thing, and of course there are times and places for having fun in design for various reasons that is going to help whatever you're creating be more successful. But I think that at its core, it's a problem-solving activity, and it requires a lot of empathy with the people you're designing for. And if you can do that, I think that you've got most of it solved.
Yeah. Wow. I so enjoyed, today talking to you, listening to your thoughts, really inspiring, really gives a lot of, sort of, hope, and also gives a lot of, way to look forward in terms of, what design, the next chapter in design would be, and, where it will take us. So it was like a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for coming today and, sharing your thoughts with us. This is just a small token of love and appreciation from our side, where we confer on you the title of Inspiring Designers. So thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts. It will inspire the next generation of designers. Also, some of the things that you said are really resonating currently with everybody, I'm sure, here in the team. But yeah, for all the viewers as well, it would be great thoughts. So thank you once again for taking this time and talking to us. Folks watching us today, I hope this has inspired you, and stay inspired, keep designing. Until next time. Thank you guys.